Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Wagner founder Yevgeny Prigozhin says there's no sign Ukraine is quitting Bakhmut. Greece promises more military support to Ukraine, plus Chinese President Xi Jinping says China is willing to work with France to call for international efforts on political settlement of Ukraine crisis. Thank you so much for joining us, and very good morning to you. Authorities in Russian-controlled areas of eastern Ukraine said a total of 7 civilians have been killed in 2 separate Ukrainian artillery strikes. 4 civilians died in Donetsk when shells hit a car park, and another 6 people were injured. Authorities say another 3 people died in blasts at a bus stop in Lysychansk, some 120 kilometers to the northeast of Donetsk. Donetsk, capital of the Ukrainian province of the same name, has been controlled by Russian proxy forces since 2014, but remains close to the front line of Russia's war with Ukraine and regularly comes under fire from Ukrainian forces. Meanwhile, Ukrainian soldiers trained on an armored personnel carrier and shot at targets on a shooting range near Bakhmut. The commander of the 6th Separate Assault Brigade, 41-year-old Ivan, said he trained soldiers before they went to the front line. He says the task on the training ground is to prepare the soldiers step by step to do the fine-tuning. Ukrainian and Russian forces battled in the streets of Bakhmut, eastern Ukraine's devastated fortress city, where Ukrainian soldiers say they were ready to launch their long-anticipated counteroffensive once the weather improves. The month-long battle for Bakhmut, one of the last urban centers in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk province yet to fall to Moscow, has proven one of the bloodiest of Russia's invasion, now in its 14th month. Greece says it will support Ukraine militarily as long as it takes, as the country's 2 defense ministers met in Athens, to support them as long as it takes. Greece has joined its European counterparts in providing military and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine since the start of the conflict, condemning Russia's actions. Some 20,000 displaced Ukrainians are currently in Greece. The Greek defense minister said 3,870 tons of military assistance has been sent to Ukraine, including Stinger missiles, ammunition, vehicles and rockets, and the country will continue to provide more military equipment in the future. While Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reskinov said his country was eager to draw military knowledge from Greece's naval forces in the future, including in sectors such as demining.
Looking forward of discussing further ways to strengthen our defense ties and provide every possible support to Ukraine at this very important and crucial stage of the war. We will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. That's our very clear position.
Your country absolutely clear understand what it means to have the threats from the neighbors, and I know that you support us because you know what it means, all these kind of threats. And I'm going to discuss with you not only the current situation in the battlefield, our plans, and I also would like to discuss strategic issues. Because after this war, after the victory of Ukraine in this war, together with our partners, we will continue to develop our defense capabilities.
We discuss possible ways of establishing peace and restoring security in Europe, including the mechanism on further strengthening sanctions against the aggressor, and particularly in defense industry also as well.
We both expressed our strong will to work together in order to enhance our bilateral defense cooperation. I also reaffirmed our firm and principled position to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian armed forces in their inherent right to defend their homeland and restore the sovereignty as well as the territorial integrity of their country.
Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu visited arms and armored vehicles factories in Russia's Nizhny Novgorod region. According to the Defense Ministry, Shoigu inspected a facility that produces artillery and aviation ammunition for use in what Russia calls its special military operation in Ukraine. The minister also reportedly visited the Arzamas machine building plant, where he inspected assembly lines and workshops for the production of armored personnel carriers of various modifications and armored vehicles called the Tiger. During the trip, Shoigu was reportedly told that the new double armor of advanced models could withstand a blast from 2 kilograms of TNT, as well as providing protection from a wide array of projectiles. The head of Russia's private Wagner militia, Yevgeny Prigozhin, says that Ukrainian forces were not abandoning the city of Bakhmut, but that even if they did, he will need more support from the regular militaries before trying to advance further. President Volodymyr Zelensky had on Wednesday raised the prospect of a withdrawal from the city, saying that Kiev will take the corresponding decision if its forces risk being encircled by Russian troops. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has said that the capture of Bakhmut will open up the battlefield and allow Russia to advance further into eastern Ukraine. But the Wagner founder, who's accused the military top brass of ineffectiveness bordering on treason in recent months, said this was still some way off. He says Ukrainian troops had organized staunch defenses inside the city, particularly along railway lines and in high-rise buildings in the west of the city, and that if they fell back, they will take up new positions in the outskirts and in Chasiv Yar to the west. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom's military intelligence believes that Russian troops have regained some momentum in the battle for Bakhmut and have likely advanced into the town center. UK military intelligence said in its daily report that locally, Wagner and Russian commanders have paused the ongoing feud and improved cooperation. It adds that Russian airborne troops are likely to have provided reinforcement, and overall, Russia is again using artillery more effectively. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has met with Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu in the Turkish capital of Ankara for talks that will include the war in Ukraine. Ahead of the bilateral talks, Lavrov and his delegation attended a fast-breaking Ramadan dinner with Turkish counterparts. Cavusoglu previously said he will discuss developments in the Ukraine war with Lavrov during his visit. In the meantime, French President Emmanuel Macron urged China's President Xi Jinping to reason with Russia and help bring an end to the war in Ukraine, as the two held the first of a series of high-level meetings in Beijing. Mr. Macron told reporters that Europe must resist reducing trade and diplomatic ties with Beijing, who is at odds with the West over issues including Taiwan, sensitive technology, and China's close ties with Russia.
The Russian aggression in Ukraine has dealt a blow to this stability. It ended decades of peace in Europe. I know I can count on you, moreover, under the two principles I have just mentioned, to bring Russia to its senses and everyone in the negotiating table. And we will come back to this in detail. But we need to find a lasting peace. That is to say, a peace that respects internationally recognized borders and avoid any form of escalation. I believe that this is also an important question for China, as much as it is for France and for Europe.
President of France, Emmanuel Macron. Now we'll be speaking with Mr. Dennis Rever, researcher, Institute for Security Studies, joining us from Pretoria in South Africa. You're welcome to the program this morning.
Good morning.
let's begin with the state visit from Emmanuel Macron to China. Now, we know that Emmanuel Macron, love him or hate him, is front and center with the French nationalist agenda. He's going everywhere, consolidating France's position on the global scene. Some going as far as saying that as an international power broker. Whether he's successful or not is another conversation entirely. But in this visit to China, he goes with a retinue of business people to further trade ties with China, to further relations with China. And there's this Ukraine issue. What do you make of Emmanuel Macron's diplomacy concerning the Ukraine war?
It's a very interesting and complicated question, and I'll try to shorten my answer for the sake of time, but it's something that we can discuss for a very long time, I think, because a lot of dynamics are being intermixed in this regard. Of course, France has interests in the greater Indo-Pacific, so the Indian Pacific Oceans, and they've unveiled a strategy recently in that regard, and the strategy has been criticized by China, so there's a challenge in this regard. China itself is going through a bad round of relations with the US, and the diplomatic relationship has been on a low, one of the historic lows. So there are a lot of these trends and dynamics that come into play. And I think for either of the country, Ukraine is not necessarily the biggest priority in this regard, but it's something that countries are willing to discuss and perhaps put on the table as sort of a negotiation tool. France has changed its rhetoric towards Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. You may recall that at the start of the war, France has been very reluctant to support Ukraine militarily, and diplomatically has been very cautious. Macron last year has been very active, calling President Putin, trying to convince him to find a diplomatic solution to this war. French position towards the war in Ukraine has changed since. France has supplied Ukraine with light tanks earlier this year. So in that regard, I think French position is now firmly in line with the European position on the war in Ukraine, and that is to support Ukraine. Chinese position on the war in Ukraine has also been developing. China has been quite vocal in recent time, proposing a peace deal. But again, I wouldn't see this peace deal as an end in itself. It's more likely to be a negotiation tool to speak to the US, to speak to Europe, and to find some sort of a solution. But it's a very complex mix of various trends and dynamics coming into play here.
Has the European Union under Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission, effectively outmaneuvered itself from any sort of conciliation, mediation with Russia, and have to rely on countries such as France and the goodwill of countries such as Turkey, who have their own serious internal problems? Even Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, who had his own problems with judicial reform and the call against the strength of his position in his party in Israel. So he has his own problems there, not to talk of the recent issues with alleged Hamas shooting out of Lebanon into Israel. So all these countries that are being relied on for mediation efforts have their own serious internal problems, and one has to wait and see which one has enough impetus to convince Russia to step back from its aggression. What's your impression of this international mediation and what the other countries are doing?
I think, if I can be frank, a lot will depend on the announced Ukrainian counteroffensive that is supposed to take place later in May this year. And we see how the situation on the battlefield affects not just the support that Ukraine receives, but also the diplomatic position of various countries. So, for instance, before the autumn offensive that took place, the counteroffensive of Ukrainian forces that took place last year in September, where Ukraine successfully took back a lot of the previously occupied territories, including the city of Kherson. We've seen that a number of European countries were reluctant to support Ukraine because they were still not sure how the war will unfold. And we see that a successful counteroffensive has tipped a number of countries, including Germany, for instance, to be more active in their support. So depending on how the counteroffensive in May goes and whether it's successful for Ukraine or not, we may see that affecting the negotiations and the positions from which Ukraine and Russia negotiate this peace. I agree with you that the European Union has taken itself out as a potential mediator, but I also think that this was inevitable. A number of European Union countries like Poland, the Baltic states, have been very clear on their position on this war from the start. So it was inevitable that the European Union, representing the member states, would not be able to maintain a neutrality. But I think the most likely negotiating partner or the neutral partner that can bring Ukraine and Russia together is Turkey. And as it was mentioned in the program earlier, Lavrov has met with his counterpart in Turkey earlier this week. Turkey is a very active player in the region, and it sees itself as a very important player and positions itself as such. So I think the likely negotiations, when they will take place in Turkey, and Turkey has been very positioning itself strategically as a sort of a partner that can be relied upon by both countries, by Russia and by Ukraine. Case in point, their part that they played in the grain deal that was, I think, relatively successful and successfully helped the world to avert the food crisis, a potential food crisis. So I think when it comes to the potential partners, I think Turkey is the most likely candidate. I don't think China or any other country would fit this role. I think the Chinese peace plan that was proposed earlier this year has been has received a lot of negative reaction from Ukraine, and I think that rules out China as a potential mediator. But Turkey definitely is one of those countries that can take it forward.
Staying with this angle and concerning Africa, out of which we are broadcasting, and specifically to South Africa, where you are, who've not been vocally condemning the Russian invasion or taking a position that is in any way hardline against Russia. What is the position, if you can shed some light for us on South Africa? We know about the Brits connection. But what do you think is the position officially of the South African government?
So officially, the South African government is neutral, and it takes itself as a neutral party in this war. But there is a very important clarification in this regard. South Africa sees itself as a non-aligned country, and the non-alignment should be seen as a different to neutrality. Non-alignment assumes that a country like South Africa should be free to engage with all parties to the conflict, and to do it productively and to achieve their national interests. So South Africa maintains that they shouldn't be seen as part of the war. They shouldn't be involved in the war that is happening in Europe. It is their right to engage constructively with Russia, with China, and with Ukraine and the West, broader West, when such opportunities emerge. So this has been the position officially. Whether South Africa managed or manages to maintain this position we will see in the near future. The naval exercises that took place earlier this year forced a lot of countries to question the South African position and whether South Africa is indeed neutral. We obviously know that President Putin has received he's been named as war criminal, potential war criminal by the ICC court. And of course, South Africa is part of the Roman statute. It would be obliged to arrest President Putin if he lands in Pretoria. So in that regard, we will see how this will play out. But for the moment, I think South Africa still attempts to maintain a consistent, neutral, non-aligned approach when it comes to this war, which obviously results in a lot of criticism from the European countries and Ukraine for its engagements with Russia.
Thank you so much for your insight and contributions to the program this morning. We appreciate it. Mr. Denis Rava, researcher, Institute of Security Studies from Pretoria in South Africa.
Thank you for having me.
After the break, White House condemns Russian refusal to provide consular access to detain Wall Street Journal reporter Ivan Gershkovich. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Chinese President Xi Jinping says China will join hands with France in urging the international community to work for a political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. On the Ukraine crisis, he says that China advocates peace talks and a political solution. He also adds that the international community should work together to cope with spillovers from the Ukraine crisis in such fields as food, energy, finance, and transportation, and reduce the negative impact of the crisis on the world, especially developing countries.
China advocates peace talks and a political solution to the Ukraine crisis. China is willing to work with France to call on the international community to stay rational and exercise restraint, refrain from taking actions that may make the situation become worse or even run out of control. Members of the international community should strictly abide by the international humanitarian law, avoid attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure, and protect women, children, and other victims of the conflict. It's imperative for the parties concerned to honor their commitment that nuclear weapons must not be used and that nuclear wars must not be fought. Oppose the use of biochemical weapons under any circumstance, and oppose armed attacks against nuclear power plants or other peaceful nuclear facilities. Peaceful talks should be resumed as soon as possible. The international community should work for a political settlement that accommodates all parties' legitimate security concerns in accordance with the purposes and principles of this UN Charter and build a balanced, effective, and sustainable security architecture in Europe. The international community should work together to cope with spillovers from the Ukraine crisis in such fields as food, energy, finance, and transportation, and reduce negative impacts of the crisis on the world, especially developing countries.
In the United States, the White House says Russia's refusal to give consular access to detain Wall Street Journal reporter Ivan Gershkovich is inexcusable. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said the United States needs to get consular access to the journalist.
We still haven't been able to get consular access, and that's an issue that we continually bring up through our embassy in Moscow with the Russians. I wish I had a good answer for that, because it's inexcusable. We need to get consular access to Evan. I won't get ahead of where we are, and I think you can understand why we would certainly want to talk about potential negotiations here from the podium. We're at a very early stage here. Main goal is to get consular access to him so we can have that contact and that connectivity. We're doing what we can to keep his employer and the family informed. Our focus is squarely on that right now.
A court in the Russian town of Yefremov heard on a case concerning the parental rights of a certain Alexei Moskolov, a Russian man recently convicted of discrediting the country's armed forces. The case gained widespread media attention when his 13-year-old daughter, Masha, was taken into care after her school notified the authorities of anti-war drawings made by her. Just hours before Thursday's hearing, Russia's Children's Rights Commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova, said that she had spoken to the girl's mother, with whom Masha had been estranged, and that she'd since taken her daughter from Kiev. Now, Moskilov, who was given a 2-year jail term for discrediting the Russian army, had left Masha in the hands of the state as the girl's mother. The father and daughter first came to the authorities' attention after she drew a picture in a school art class last year that featured Russian missiles flying towards Ukraine and the slogans "Glory to Ukraine" and "No to Putin, no to war." Meanwhile, Russian prosecutors have requested a 25-year prison sentence for the opposition politician Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is on trial for treason. His lawyer, Maria Esmont, said that the process is moving unexpectedly fast and the next hearing will be later today. Now, Kara-Murza, who is also charged with running an undesirable organization and spreading false information about the Russian army, will remain in custody until August the 27th. The United States, on March 3rd, imposed sanctions on 6 Russians it said were involved in the arrest, prosecution, or abuse of Kara-Murza, who was detained last year after speaking out against what Moscow calls a special military operation in Ukraine. Now we're pleased to talk with Ambassador Joe Keshi, former Permanent Secretary of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but never was there a time such as this that China seems to hold such sway internationally, with the visit of the French President Emmanuel Macron to China to seek Xi Jinping's intervention, if you will, concerning the Ukraine war, given that he just had a meeting, that is Jinping and Putin, and didn't give, according to many standards, a desirable alternative to the end of the war, for which the Ukrainians are calling for a complete withdrawal of troops. And then we have the EU as well, seeming to, not to speak too harshly, but pandering to China to find some sort of solution. Is the influence of the United States waning internationally?
I think what you are seeing is that in some ways, and we have to wait to see, we are probably seeing that the international system, world order that was created in 1945, and that was basically dominated by the United States and Western powers, that is gradually coming to an end. China is gradually rising on its own right, and the recent foray into a number of areas that you can describe as traditionally American influence is a clear indication that one way or the other, American influence, it's waning. And you actually have to go and look at a number of factors, a number of issues, or look at the indices of development today, and you will see where America is as compared to where China is or some other countries. So gradually, it's not going to be sudden, but it's a gradual Chinese rise and influence in the world that we are beginning to see. And I think the Chinese feel very confident to do that now. They are in a good shape. The economy is doing very well, and it's expanding. And they just feel that it is time for them to begin to show that they have arrived on their own right. But this I would also say, despite what the Chinese are doing, the Chinese are not ready to play the global policeman as the United States have done in the last couple of years. And that's probably what's going to limit their ability, to be able to influence a lot of things in the world.
Now, the Wall Street Journal reporter has been accused of spying. And it's been said, and I concur, and I wonder if you do as well, that, and all of this, of course, depends on investigations and how transparent the Russians are, that if he was a spy, he chose the worst profession to choose to become a spy or spy in Russia, being a journalist. He should have just, why didn't he just have a sign on his head or on a T-shirt saying, look, investigate me, I'm a spy, I'm trying to get information. Is Russia being overtly harsh in this case to use, as some have said, the journalist as just a pawn in the scheme of things?
Yeah, you are, you are right to say this. I agree with you. But look, let me tell you something about the security agencies. They can use anybody. They use journalists, they use doctors, they use nurses, they use civil servants, they use soldiers. Look, name it. They can use anybody, and they can get anybody to work for them. But I'm not saying that this is the case of this gentleman, because he's been there for quite a long time. If you follow the history of China, particularly during the Cold War, it's very easy. Even a journalist talking to a Russian during the Cold War makes that journalist a suspect. And I think Russia has continued with that same mindset. Today. Look, we need to have a very clear understanding of Russia today, particularly Russia under Putin. Putin is one fellow that has this grandiose, mindset of recreating the old, Soviet Union, the old power, expansionist and, with a lot of states as it was under the Soviet Union. And this is what is tragic about this, Ukrainian-Russian war, and the inability of the global world itself to honestly come together and find a way to resolve it. Because there is absolutely, and I use the word, very carefully, that there's absolutely no reason for this invasion. If you take all the reasons that have been given, the expansion of NATO, how would the expansion of NATO justify the massive devastation that Russia has inflicted on Ukraine? Oh, they said they wanted the Donbas area. Why don't you just simply take the Donbas area, which is a very small part of Ukraine, occupy it, annex it, and the rest of Ukraine will live in peace? There is absolutely no justification for what we are seeing today. And it's unfortunate, that the world cannot come together and help the people of Ukraine, except that it's done, except the powers, the United States, the Chinese, and the rest of them, sort out their differences and collectively pressurize Putin, and maybe, help Ukraine in a manner that will compel Russia to think twice about the invasion.
Something very important now, or something noteworthy. You say that, and what you're alluding to is that negotiations have broken down. If we go by what Emmanuel Macron said yesterday to Xi Jinping, bring Russia back to the negotiating table with your influence, that is China, to help Putin see reason. Can we say at this point that all negotiations have effectively broken down? And what, in your experience, is what can kickstart things over again?
No, nothing except the defeat of Russia. Or if Russia begins to sense, serious defeat. But the point I'm trying to make is that the world must come together and compel and put pressure on Russia. Let's stop this argument that, and try to justify Putin's action. There is simply no justification, for the pain, for the callousness that we are seeing in Ukraine. Absolutely, there's none. And sometimes I always say this to everybody: let's reverse roles. If roles were reversed and we are the one, and our other countries are in the one receiving the kind, and Russia, is going through what Ukraine is doing, and that the people of Ukraine have the capacity, and to senselessly bomb every part of Ukraine, destroy residential quarters, bomb schools, bomb hospitals. those making the argument that they are making today, or will the Russians feel the same way? You know, we must have a sense of justice in some of these things that, take part in the war. So it's not the Russians. The Russians cannot, look, if the Russians can influence, if the Chinese can influence Russia, the last visit to Russia would have produced something. It practically produced nothing, other than the fact that the Russians want military assistance from China. So the world must come together, in my view, to work together as one body and begin to put serious pressure on China, on Russia, before they completely destroy Ukraine. In any case, they've done the worst. They've just done the worst. What else is left? Possibly to destroy Kiev and a few other cities that they are currently bombing anyway. So it's quite unfortunate.
Ambassador, therefore, what is the bone of contention for resolution? Because the Ukrainians want an unconditional withdrawal of Russian troops. You've pointed out in your earlier submission that Putin has a grandiose idea of Russian expansion post the Soviet Union, and that's the sort of a person that he is. Are we therefore at a stalemate? Do you see Russia?
Of course, we are. Yeah, of course, we're at a stalemate. And quite frankly, look, we're at a stalemate for the same reasons that you just alluded to. Any negotiation would definitely involve going back to the status quo. In other words, go back to where they were before the start of the war. But I tell you, the challenge of this is that the Russians will not agree to give up the territories they have captured. Neither will the Ukrainians be ready to allow Russia to, stay in any part of the country itself. So we are in a big stalemate. We probably need some magicians. We no longer have the likes of Henry Kissinger, to kind of, go all over the place in a shuttle diplomacy to begin to see whether, there can be some give and take here and there that will compel everybody to come to their senses. But as it is today, we're in a stalemate. And this might just be decided militarily, or, as I always argue, diplomacy, that when you are in this kind of situation, it's when everybody is tired. When the Russians are tired and they can no longer continue the war, the Ukrainians are tired and they can no longer continue the war. That's when they probably come to their senses and begin to look for people to help them to find a common ground and to resolve the issues.
Any silver lining? You mentioned Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, without compare, but we have a whole new crop of leaders and secretaries of state and foreign ministers, and who, it seems to me, at the mercy of their own personal development and their own the type of people that they are personally, not to talk about their political leanings. Kissinger was a man who was much appreciated, and as you've pointed him out in these days, much appreciated for the kind of person he is and the shuttle diplomacy that he carried on with. Is there anyone internationally you see that can take that kind of role?
So today, quite frankly, none, again, because the world is completely divided, in so many ways. Too many things are happening in the world today, and difficult to find a consensus that could really help the world. But let me say this, bear in mind that, look, the Chinese are not an uninterested partner in this business. The Chinese are cleverly, watching, following what is going on, because if the Russians succeed, the rest assured that the Chinese will be emboldened, encouraged, and more determined to go after Taiwan. So we have a kind of, big crisis on our hands in the years to come. So when you see the way the Chinese are behaving, they are quietly studying the situation. They are quietly following what's going on, and to see, because they too have been making all the right noises in recent times about Taiwan. So Taiwan remains on their orbit, and whatever happens in Ukraine between the Ukrainians and the Russians will eventually impact on the decisions that are made in Beijing on Taiwan.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Ambassador Joe Keshi, former Permanent Secretary, Minister of Foreign Affairs, for being on the program this morning.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
After the break, star tennis player Iga Swiatek says tennis missed an opportunity to send a strong message by not banning Russia and Belarus from tournaments. Do join us again. Welcome back. IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva says the International Monetary Fund expects global economic growth to dip below 3% in 2023 and to remain around 3% for the next 5 years. Georgieva said strong and coordinated monetary and fiscal policy actions to respond to the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine had prevented a much worse outcome in recent years, but growth prospects remain weak in the near and medium term, given persistently high inflation. Growth dropped by almost half to 3.4% in 2022, following the shock of Russia's war in Ukraine, following the 6.1% rebound seen in 2021. She said India and China will account for half of global growth in 2023, but about 90% of advanced economies will see a decline in their growth rate this year. And now,
global growth for the next 5 years to remain around 3%. This is our lowest medium-term growth forecast since 1990. It is well below the average of 3.8% we had in the pre-COVID decade. And it makes it even harder to reduce poverty, to heal the economic scars of the COVID crisis, to provide new and better opportunities to all. Getting up this hill would require major step changes. Global growth in 2022 dropped by almost half, from 6.1 to 3.4%. And this slowdown continues this year. Despite surprisingly resilient labor markets and strong consumer demand, despite the uplift in China, we expect the world economy to grow less than 3% this year. And you would see in our World Economic Outlook that is coming next week that growth remains historically weak now and in the medium term. There are significant differences in these growth projections among country groups. We do see some momentum coming from emerging market economies, especially from Asia. This year, India and China are going to deliver half of global growth. But we have quite a number of economies that are facing a very stiff climb. Economic activity is slowing down in 90% of advanced economies, in the US, in the euro area, where high interest rates weigh on demand. And we are going to see in low-income countries higher borrowing costs coming at a time of weakening demand for their exports. With rising geopolitical tensions, with inflation still running high, a robust recovery remains elusive. And that harms the prospects of everyone, especially for the most vulnerable people and the most vulnerable countries.
And now we're joining Ini John Mekwa, who joins us for more perspective on the issues. Ini, Russia's second largest bank reported the record annual loss, $7.7 billion because of the sanctions recently.
Yes, so this bank is called VTB, it's the second largest bank in Russia, and they deal a whole lot with trading between Russia and other countries, so more of foreign currency, more of foreign trade. So it's understandable that they lost, but I mean, the loss is just so much, because last 2021, they made a profit of about $4 billion. Now, they went from making a profit of $4 billion to making a loss of $7.7 billion.
So that just effectively erases their profit.
Exactly. And they used to employ about 80,000 members of staff. What's going to happen to those people? You understand? They had subsidiaries in European countries and all of that. Obviously, most of those subsidiaries are closed. So while we see Russia facing up and putting in some efforts and strategies to couch or cover or buffer the economy against the sanctions, we can see in cases like this that the sanction is actually hitting on the Russian economy, because this is majority shares of this bank belongs to the state, that belongs to the Russian state. So obviously this is eating into them. How are they going to sustain? This is just looking at 2021 to 2022. What's going to happen if the war continues at the end of 2023, 2024, if they are losing $7.7 billion in 1 year?
Now, the MD of the IMF, a speech that we just saw.
Exactly. Well, it's just the reality of what we've been talking about. We've seen inflation skyrocket in almost all the countries, including the most Western and most developed of the countries. We've seen everybody dealing with, we've seen the issue of debts. For instance, about 15% of low-income countries are already debt-stressed. And according to the IMF, 25% of emerging economies, one of which is Nigeria, are at risk of defaulting at their debts by the end of the year. That's 25%, that's a quarter of the emerging economy. That's scary, And unfortunately, IMF is still saying that, hike of rates is one of the major ways they can curb. And that comes, of course, with the consequences, that economies will have to face. And it will also, of course, bite into your pocket and my pocket. And then we'll see it in the GDP at the close of day for dealing with every economy.
You've heard the term follow the money in Sudan. Well, follow the INI after the break or the end of the program for business after this program. Thank you, INI.
Thank you for having me.
Tennis missed an opportunity to send a strong message to Moscow by failing to impose a blanket ban on players from Russia and its ally Belarus after the invasion of Ukraine. That's according to world number one, Iga Swiatek. Wimbledon banned players from the two countries last year after the invasion, which Moscow calls a special military operation, but said in March that it will now accept them as neutral athletes. The 2022 tournament was the first time players were excluded on grounds of nationality.
I feel like tennis from the beginning could do a little bit better in showing everybody that tennis players are against the war, and that all these federations, I feel like they could do a little bit more to make that point and tell their views, and also kind of help us cope a little bit better in the locker room, because the atmosphere there is pretty tense. It's not their fault that they have a passport like that, but on the other hand, we all have some kind of impact, and I feel like anything that would help, stop the Russian aggression in sports, we should go that way, in terms of all the decisions that these federations are making. So it's easy to say that, but when you're seeing that people face to face in a locker room, it's a little bit different. To kind of use have my impact on people and remind people, all over the world, wherever I play, that the war is still out there, and that we should do a little bit more to support Ukrainians. And we as athletes, I feel like we have a pretty strong voice, and we're public persons, and we can use that the proper way to show good values, and be good examples.
And that's where we leave it in today's edition of special coverage of Russian invasion. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend.